Joining us to survey Campaign 08 in New Zealand are speechwriter, commentator and blogger David Slack, former Prime Ministerial Media Advisor and biographer Brian Edwards, and Press Gallery stalwart Barry Soper, who has seen them come and go. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. David, if we could start with you, I don't think anyone's ever going to teach their dog to say John Key, are they?
Are they going to bother?
No.
Boy, what a week. From memory, it's the first time we've had an election the same week in the same year as the Americans since 1972, and that was a very, very different outcome. Labour landslide.
Well, it's the first November election we've had since 1999, so we missed a few opportunities as well. So, what impact do you think the US election, being in such proximity, had? I got the impression, say, the last leaders' debate, I got the impression that neither one of them, after what had happened, wanted to be nasty.
Well, yes, he is a good example for everybody. And, you know, I was thinking about his speech, his acceptance speech. It was a very good illustration of how somebody can take the commonplace and turn it into something magical. And this is a guy who can create a sense of possibility, and that might sound waffly, but actually, if you can create a sense of possibility and make people feel that tomorrow morning they can do something new, if you can make a whole country do that, then you're onto something special. And John Key was always going to be on to a hiding to nothing, trying to follow in those footsteps. But in some respects, maybe, you know, we know that Times Square isn't tie-happy, and what happens here is not the same thing, but certainly there's a chasm between those two politicians.
But that seemed to work for Key. I mean, Brian, what did you make of the way Key was presented? You're an expert in this sort of thing. It did work, and it made it hard for Helen Clark to attack him, didn't it?
I thought we had a rerun of 1984, actually, because I think that the role that was being played by John Key was very similar to the role that was being played by David Lange. So in 1984, David Lange's job was to be the front man for the policies that we would eventually call Rogernomics, and he was to be the nice, acceptable, warm, friendly, avuncular face of these rather nasty policies that were about to come.
But you would say that, Brian.
Well, of course I would say it, and I'll be saying that for the rest of the programme. But the same really, I think the same really applies to John Key, that John Key's job was not to frighten the horses. It was an expression which actually Lockwood Smith used. He was there not to frighten the horses, so he had to be nice, he had to be inoffensive, he had to be seen with a lot of children, he had to kiss a lot of babies, all that sort of thing. And that really works.
Well, I thought it was interesting. By the time we'd seen Roger Douglas on TV3's coverage, Matthew Hooton spent the rest of the evening telling us to pay no heed to that man, and that John Key was going to be...
Yeah, well, there was
going to give everyone a pony,
this nasty
basically.
sort of fellow lurking in the background there. But I'm quite serious about that theory. I think we have two very similar situations going on here. And that was the role. The role was to be the acceptable face, the nice face, the don't worry about his face, that would make the whole thing palatable for the future.
Do you buy that, Barry?
The last publicly elected Prime Minister, Rob Muldoon, he was the last one to be defeated by the public vote, just as Helen Clark was, because all the rest were elected mid-term by their caucuses. So that was quite important. But I think the great mistake that Labor made was attacking John Key on trust and then sending Mike Williams off to Melbourne to try and dig the dirt on him. And to me, that was the turning point of the campaign. And I think it was quite appropriate and rather sad that Helen Clark fell over in a shopping mall, because that was when, to me, their campaign fell over as well.
I agree with that, absolutely. But the issue there actually is if you're going to do that, because everybody does it. Because at the same time that Mike Williams was trying to dig dirt on John Key, the National Party was trying to dig dirt on Peter Davis. Now, that's like trying to dig dirt on the Dalai Lama, really. You know, because, I mean, this man is so squeaky clean, it's ridiculous. But if you're going to do it, you've got to do it well, don't you? And it was just done horribly badly.
And the thing that I found absolutely fascinating was that Helen Clark kept repeating, look, if there was nothing in this, why did the New Zealand Herald send a journalist over to Melbourne? Well, the only reason the New Zealand Herald sent a journalist to Melbourne was that they were tipped off by the Labor Party.
But when do you think they realised they didn't have a story? Because it was fascinating.
Well,
I looked at the story as it evolved on the Herald website on the Wednesday. It went through 3 or 4 different incarnations. The language was dialed back in every
5 p.m. somewhere between
and
5 and 7.
I could not work out when they thought they didn't have a story.
And then suddenly it was this hot potato they had to chuck back at Labor, and suddenly it was an entirely different story. And by the time it hit the front page the next morning, it was HV blowing up in their face.
You know, they talk too much. much. If you live in Heron Bay as I do, and you walk down, past all those famous Ponsonby cafes and latte places, you would meet people like Mike Williams telling you, this is 6 months ago, about this neutron bomb that was going to come out. That's not it's stupid.
And see, the problem with the neutron bomb is it had a homing device attached to it, and it landed right back in Labor's lap, and that was the biggest problem. That really, no matter how much they tried to distance themselves from it, and it was really sad for Helen Clark, because I think all of us would agree, particularly Brian, that Helen Clark is a spectacular politician. She's very competent at her job, and it's rather sad in a way that the country gets rid of somebody that is so competent, but I guess that everybody felt that it was time for a change, and that was the result.
So what you've just said is very interesting there, isn't it? This time for a change thing. If you watch the TVNZ coverage on election night, where Pippa Wetzel went up onto the roof of the TVNZ centre there and talked to all these young people, I mean, these young people were all the sort of people you see in the celebrity magazines, in the Sunday Star Times and the Herald on Sunday, being photographed.
Not proper people in Labour voters, then, Brian.
They were mindless bimbos, actually, not to put too fine a point at it.
Because they said they'd vote National.
And not just for that reason, though that is a good reason. But when they were asked, because they were all apparently voting National, why are you voting National? Why have you changed their mind? They all said, well, it's time for a change. And it sounded as though the argument was, for the last 2 years, we've gone to Queenstown for our holidays. So really, this year, we ought to go to Tai Happy, And there was as much substance in that argument. But what you see is this is a very powerful slogan, isn't it? A very powerful slogan.
It's been used before by, Labour.
By Norman Kirk, I think.
Yeah,
probably.
Indeed, time for a change. And it was
just to go back to that question of the tone of of those debates. I was looking at her behaviour in those first two debates and thinking, what happened to Nice Helen? I think back to 1999 when she won the election. It was because she was the calmest voice, the most composed voice and the most reassuring voice. That's what you look for in a leader. And while she was doing that, she was terrific, and she found that voice again in the last
the crack about Key shouting at home, I thought was a pivotal moment in the media part of the campaign.
Hold on, as everybody knows, both sides rehearsed those debates.
So was it a line that you gave? It's surely not right.
But sometimes things just come out like that. I mean, they come out wrong. I agree with you entirely. That was extremely unfortunate. It came out wrong. And there's also no doubt at all that I think we were all somewhat surprised by how well Key did in that. One of the interesting things about that debate was how Helen got blamed for so many things, You were involved in something she got blamed for. You asked her about the Springbok tour.
Well, I asked John Key about the
You asked him about the Springbok tour, and then she got blamed for bringing that up in the first place.
Well, you want to see the letters that I got saying that I'm a Labour Party stooge.
And yet, it was actually, I hate to say this, Barry, it was actually a very good question. Because...
and it wasn't given to me by Brian.
No. Though all the others were.
Which I didn't get to ask.
Anyway, you're going to have to hold all those thoughts. And maybe we can talk about whether we learned anything about policy in those debates, because I rather feel that I didn't watching them. But we will take a break now. On return, we'll join Simon Pound on his election night tour of the parties.